Hi, my name is Mike Glenn, and I am the president of the Engaged Church Network, and we have put this podcast together to help those of you who serve in the local church setting understand all of the changing dynamics that are going on right now in the life of local churches. Joining me today is Miles Terry. Miles is a practicing attorney focusing on nonprofits, churches, schools, and that kind of thing. So Miles, give folks a little of your background and how you ended up in this space.
So I grew up in the church and was active many years ago in ministry. I was in college. I was on a church staff of my local church, and very much was in love with ministry and wanted to pursue it. And but different doors shut and different doors opened, and I eventually followed a different path to law school and did some graduate work as well, and spent 15 years working for one of the largest nonprofit legal organizations in the country, and did a lot of my clients were churches, nonprofits. I've spent 15 years in this space, and so now my current practice is engaged in what we call church law. It's churches, pastors, religious ministries, Christian schools, and that's all we do. We provide general counsel services to those types of religious entities, and we don't do anything else. That's all we do. We have a background in it. We enjoy it, and it's kind of a niche that it's a new developing area of law. Everybody's familiar with family law or real estate law or personal injury law. Church law is something it's kind of new. It's a new development, and it's focused
But it
specifically.
used to be for a long time, churches weren't never sued, or that was kind of the walking around wisdom that nobody would ever sue a church, and if you did sue a church, you couldn't win.
Well, and it was also considered it was bad form to sue a church.
Yeah.
It would look bad, and the problem though is that as we've learned from the legal perspective, but I think churches are learning now too, is that if you think about it, churches and pastors, they they're linked to more liability on any given day or any given week or weekend than any other entity, whether religious or non-religious, any other entity in their community. Even you've got a business that people come Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and they're taking on liability when people step foot in their parking lot or in the front door. But churches, for the most part, gather more liability, and it's liability they actually invite, and they're inviting it for free. They're not getting paid. They're not in it to. I joke with a lot of my clients that you're kind of crazy to start a church, honestly, and they. If it wasn't for the mission that you're called to, why would you invite so much liability into your own life?
I remember one of the big discussions that leadership had with me is there was a group of kids skateboarding in the parking lot of our church. And I went out there and met the kids, talked to the kids, told them it was fine to skateboard and all that. And then somebody pulled me aside and said, "You do realize if one of those kids falls,
we're responsible.
We're going to be sued."
For maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars back in the day, if not millions. Yeah. And so, so you have all this liability. And so churches are, we're living in a it used to be a postmodern America. Now we're redefining it as a post-Christian.
Post-Christian, yeah.
So you're living in a post-Christian world, and which I know you've got a new book coming out soon
right, yeah.
On that very subject, but you're living in this post-Christian world, and so it's already becoming harder to reach people and to advance the Great Commission. But then on top of that, you've got government regulation that's now becoming more prevalent with churches. You've got employment laws that are becoming more prevalent with churches. You've got just sheer growth, and because of that growth, liability. And churches now are facing issues that churches 5-6 decades ago never would have even considered. And so there's a need. There's a need for churches for legal counsel. And what we found is that over the last 15 years of doing this is that pretty much most churches know of an attorney or have an attorney that goes to their church.
Right.
And so when they do have a legal question or an issue that comes up, they know somebody to talk to. The problem though is that most of these attorneys are practicing other areas of law, and they don't understand the specific areas unique to a religious organization.
And the case law that has been
is constantly changing and developing, and so they do their best to help them, but they're not. It's more from a reactionary posture of it's always too late at that point.
Right.
They have a problem pop up. Hey, do you know? Can Joe come in and help us with this? He's like, well, I really do real estate closings.
Right.
I really don't know how to advise you on this issue with your youth pastor or issue with a board member, but I'll do my best. And so they do it pro bono, but they really don't know what they're doing. And so what we have found is we take a different approach to the practice of law with churches. We take an approach that it's more like preventative medicine. We want to be proactive. We don't want to be reactionary. We want to get involved with the daily life and the normal life of a church, get involved in every aspect of the church, and provide ongoing proactive counsel in real time. Because from what we have found is most issues, if you can just have proper legal counsel, they'll never result in issues. They'll never evolve. You deal with them.
Find yourself on the headlines.
Correct. Yeah, it's always, if you're going to have an event and you need a waiver or you need proper insurance, it's always better to be proactive and handle it on the front end. You can never make issues go away. You'll always have issues. That's the world we find ourselves in. But to be prepared and have a plan up front, for the most part, in our experience, it's eliminated most of the issues that churches face.
Okay, let's go back and level set this. I had the opportunity and the privilege of studying at some of the best schools in America. I really did, and my seminary education was on par with anything that you would find anywhere else. We never touched on this.
Yeah.
So I show up as a pastor, and I have no idea about what documents you need, what it means to be a 501c3, what is allowed for a 501c3,
yes,
what is not allowed for a 501c3. So I'm a pastor. I'm sitting at home. I'm watching this podcast. What are the essentials legally that you have to have in a local church setting?
Well, so I'll preface that with this. The great thing is that if you do it the right way, but you have a constitutional right to have a church and you have a unique status as a 501c3, unlike any other nonprofit. Most nonprofits that are not considered churches, while they may apply to be a 501c3, they've got to actually apply and go through a long process, and they have to wait for the government to actually grant them that. But under the United States Constitution, as a church, you are automatically a 501c3. It's inherent in your existence as a nonprofit, a church nonprofit in our country. And so the good news is you don't have a lot of regulation. There's certain regulations that the government's just not allowed to involve themselves in the church. Having said that, every church needs structure. They need structure both in operations. They need structure in how they govern themselves. They need structure in how they self-regulate themselves and how they grow. And so every church needs a leadership model. And it's very unique. What you're talking about with, you didn't learn this in seminary.
Right.
We do have that in common. In fact, that I finished a master's in divinity recently, many, many years after a law degree, and I can tell you that's true. That's going through 3 years of MDiv. We learned pretty much everything except how to set up and run a church. And what's even crazier is 15 years before this MDiv, getting my law degree, my wife and I both went to law school, and we always joke about the fact that you go to 3 years of law school, and by the end of it, you've received an incredible legal education, but they don't teach you how to run a law firm.
Yeah.
So it's very similar, and that you have to get out and you have to figure it out. And one of the things that we've learned is, both from a legal and a religious perspective, there's not these are the 10 steps of how to set up a church from the Apostle Paul to the other, to the Corinthian church. It's there are principles that we can deduce from different Pauline teachings in the New Testament of how to set up. What are the requirements of an elder? What are the guidelines for a pastor? What are the guidelines for deacons and other
mutual accountability structure?
Mutual accountability and operations. I mean, there's a point at which the disciples, and you would know the citation better than I would. I always have a hard time recalling it, but where the apostle came up and said, "Hey, we're busy trying to
Acts 6.
We're busy trying to minister and pray and seek God's will and guidance here and minister to the people, we don't have time to wait on tables and take care of the widows. And it wasn't that they were saying that we're better than that. It was that they said that we know our lane. We're trying to stay in it. So we need leadership. We need to develop. We need the people in the church who are called to do those things, to be empowered and given the authority to do so. And so we have, I would go back to your original question, is that the tough thing is there's not an exact model prescribed in the New Testament for how you want to set up a church governing structure. But there is a lot of guidance. And so I say that all to say, if anybody says, well, this is the only Christian way to run a church, that's not true. There are principles that everybody should follow that are universal. But I've got clients who have very strong churches with a lot of integrity in the process they're set up with a board of trustees model. I've got some that are set up with an elders or a deacons model, and the deacons control everything. I've got some that are set up where the pastor felt called to start a church. He started it. He's kind of like, it's a one-man show.
And he's kept everything.
He's kept everything kind of within his purview. But for all of those models, as you probably know better than anybody, there's advantages and disadvantages to all of them. And so what we try to do is not tell people there's only, one size fits all. We try to take our client as we find them. We take our client as we find them and say, well, where are you now? Where would you like to go? And how can we help you build out a structure that's reflective of the unique personality of your community, but is also got checks and balances there to protect you, protect your leaders, protect your people, and have integrity in the process.
So that's the Constitution and bylaws?
You need a Constitution and bylaws. You need a strong governing model with checks and balances that allows you to keep everybody protected and keep integrity in the process, but also allows you to grow. I know at Brentwood, you guys went through this probably a decade or so ago. Everybody looks at the 9 campuses that you have now and how much growth you've had. Very few people realize how many years you guys spent building out, doing what I would call a non-physical building campaign, where you spent several years building out saying this is our current structure. This structure is not big enough and flexible enough to allow us to grow to 9 campuses. But we see the growth coming in our community, and before we can start raising money to build more campuses.
Well, we had the old Southern Baptist thing of, everything had to be by congregational vote.
Yes.
And you had to call a special meeting. You had to give at least a week's notice. Well, it took us 6-7 weeks to make a decision, and you don't have time to do that anymore.
And in a small church startup or a church plant or a small town church, there's nothing wrong with that model. That can be a very great model, but it gets to the point where if the people can't have the ability and it's feasible to get people together regularly to build consensus, you have to look at a different model. And you guys did that very well in saying this is where we are now. This is where we want to be. How are we going to change our model governance-wise and bylaws? And you guys went through, I think, probably a multi-year process.
2 or 3 year period.
Of redoing that, and also not just rewriting it and saying, well, everybody, this is the way it's going to be, like it or leave it. You guys had to build consensus.
No, you got to have all those listening sessions.
And consistent. And so I tell a lot of clients, like, listen, if you want to have the church congregation vote on everything, or you want to have the board vote on everything, and they don't want to delegate that authority to officers and other people, that's fine. But as you guys need to show up every morning at 8.
Yeah.
We'll keep you busy till 5, and we'll see you the next morning. And a lot of board members are like, well, yeah, I want to be involved, but I can't.
I don't need that. Yeah.
Don't need that. And so if they're not going to do that, then you've got to build a different type of model that, again, that's healthy and it's got balances, but it reflects the personality of the church.
What are some of, you work with a lot of churches. You walk into a church, they've opened their documents, you look through them. What are some of the first mistakes you see, most common mistakes?
The biggest mistake I see, and every church has this problem, is they do not maintain their documents. I've got clients who they've been in existence for 30, 40 years, and you finally have your first consultation with them. You go to the Secretary of State's website, you download all their information, and their original charter or constitution, depending on what they call it in their state, they haven't updated it
in 100 years.
100 years. and they're, I start asking them questions like, well, how do you make decisions around here? What's your process? Well, we vote as a board. And I'm like, well, your original formation documents say that you got to have a full church vote on everything.
Okay. Now, we're being a little facetious here, but if push came to shove and somebody raised the issue, they could nullify
absolutely
all the decisions that the board makes because those decisions weren't made in line with the charter document.
Absolutely. And not only could they nullify things, but then that starts creating liability. It also opens the door to government involvement and court, and specifically court involvement. There's a principle in law when it comes to churches called the ecclesiastical doctrine, which means as long as a church is following its own rules and they're following their own statement of faith and they're being consistent in that, then we're not going to get involved. We're not allowed to by the Constitution. But the minute somebody can prove in good faith that they are not following their rules and they're out of line.
You see this a lot with church splits.
Absolutely.
One congregation one group wants to go start another church, but they want the property.
They want the property.
And so they argue about who has the property, and a court will be involved.
Yeah. And that happens all the time. And then they start saying, well, let me look at your you guys have board meetings. Did you guys keep minutes? Your bylaws say you keep minutes. Why do you not have minutes? And so they start holding the church to their own standards that were self-imposed. And unfortunately, life gets busy. And, while ministry is the most important thing.
I was a pastor for 45 years total. I never wrote down on one day's job, update documents, check on documents, review documents. That was never part of my job description.
Well, and this is one of the things that inspired us to work with churches is that I had a lot of years of background working in the for-profit sector and working with a lot of family-owned businesses and providing general counsel to them. And for those listening, if they've, it's not far-fetched to say, well, obviously a small business has got legal counsel on retainer, giving us counsel regularly, and for whatever reason we've never applied that to the church. But I had clients years ago where they wanted to set up an LLC or a small business. They'd pay all this money to put together these nice corporate books and the resolutions and stock certificates and the seal, and you give it to them, and then they'd call you 10 years later when they're getting sued, and they're like, well, I mean, have we done it? And I'm like, no, you're in trouble. Like, you haven't kept the formalities. You have to keep and so we are taking a lot of the things that we were seeing in the business world and seeing the same issues in the church and saying, you know what, you would be best served to start understanding that while ministry is important, the best thing you can do to allow ministry to continue to grow and advance is to keep your house in order. And you were talking about this in a meeting earlier that I happened to be in. You were talking to some guys in the ministry. You said, listen, at the end of the day, like when it comes to raising money, it's a lot easier to ask for a donation. It's a lot easier to ask for an offering when people know that your finances.
That's right. You have trust in the system.
Yes, trust in the system and integrity. And so, while a church might not be required to have financial policies or to do an audit every year, it's great to do an audit every year.
Yeah.
You invest a little bit of money into an audit, and then you can say, hey,
we're clean.
For 20 years, like we hold ourselves to a standard higher than we should, but we do it, and it allows for a great growth in the ministry and trust.
Taking care of the original documents. What's another thing that you find?
Not being aware, being so, again, good intentions, but being so focused on ministry that you don't take the time to think about creating the structure to allow ministry to be sustainable. We often put ourselves in these situations where we're driven by our calling and passion, but we don't. And people are like, well, I got to leave it all in the field every day. I've got to go. I got to preach every Sunday. I've got to go on every mission trips. I got to do all these things, and you don't make time. You don't make time for creating a structure that creates accountability for leaders and allows for forced sabbaticals, forced rest. The most dangerous, you've said this for years and from the pulpit, the most dangerous place to be is to be a Christian leader in the church running on empty.
Right.
And most of the issues and the things that we have to clean up and scandals that we see in our line of work with churches, I would say 80% of the time, it was a good guy or a good woman who were called to ministry, highly talented, good people, but they were running on empty for a long time.
Fundamentals. You lost their prayer time, lost their Bible study time.
Always running on empty and getting, and when you start running on empty, you start getting jaded, you start getting bitter, you start getting frustrated, you start isolating yourself. And typically when you're running with accountability and oversight, that's a safe place. When you start getting off on your own, that's where you get picked off.
Well, when you are wounded,
yes,
the predator is the first one to see that.
Yes, correct. They see the blood in the water. They see that. They hear the wound, the cries.
And they'll come after you. Yeah.
Well, and so that's the first part of it. That a culture that allows leaders to get burnt out and create that. What happens over time is it starts developing what we call a vacuum in the system. And a vacuum in any system, it's a political vacuum where when you don't have structure in place to protect the process, to protect your leaders, to protect your volunteers, and keep ministry moving forward, you create a vacuum. And what happens is that vacuum, it becomes the Wild West where, people start realizing, well, I can posture myself here or play these games to get in control of this or get on that committee or
manipulate
this situation to get what I want. And that's when the personal agendas get pulled into it.
Right.
And then it creates a scenario that I think, unfortunately, we are all have had some experience in dealing with at some point or another in a church. And then that it just becomes a snowball.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, as we've mentioned, the legal landscape for local churches has changed. What do you see on the horizon? What are you afraid of?
Well, probably 10, 15 years ago, there was a big shift where legal organizations and working with churches were very concerned because of public policy changes and changes in the law that they were going to be forced to condone or officiate certain types of weddings that were against their statement of faith. And so there was a mad rush to advise people to change their bylaws to where they made it clear that this is our statement of faith and we're not going to do these types of ceremonies. And that's all fine, not to take a detour, but a lot of those churches did that, and now they're facing issues where they did that because it was in the news and everybody was all concerned about it, but they haven't really kept the formalities for the last 10, 15 years. And so if they were ever sued on that type of issue, I would be concerned, have they been consistent? Have they followed? Because, if you're big on that statement of faith, but you have kind of let your adherence to other parts of the statement of faith of your bylaws slip and you're not enforcing things consistently, you've created a loophole and a door that becomes a vulnerability. I think moving forward, a lot of things are determined by public policy and what you see politically, but there's a lot of there's a big move right now to and I'm not saying I'm for or against it, but to allow churches to apply for government funding. We were talking about that recently.
I'm against it.
Yeah, and I'm not saying I'm for or against it, but I will say this: the minute
out of COVID, there was a lot of opportunity to have your salaries reimbursed or that kind of stuff from government funds and that kind of stuff. Schools, you can have certain funds available for schools, preschool, Head Starts, and especially if you're in particular neighborhoods, there's a lot of government funding for getting those kind of things started. My thing is, and we've talked about this, is if you take Uncle Sam's money, you take Uncle Sam's rules.
Absolutely, and that's a problem. It's hard to make an argument like, well, I want your money.
Right.
But I don't want to do what you tell me to do. And it typically what happens is, there's never strings attached that you're aware of on the front end, but they happen to kind of come later. And so that's a massive issue. And you could argue it either way. That's why I want to say I'm not for or against, because, I've had situations where I've had clients over the years where the government was treating them differently than anyone else. And so there are arguments to be made. And the alternative that, if you give this to a public school or a homeowners association or a secular nonprofit, then we have every right to be treated equally under the law. So it goes both ways. But at the end of the day, when you take government money, that opens the door to other issues, and that's an area that is very quickly developing. And there's parental rights is going to be a big issue in the next 10 to 15 years. You're already seeing that politically, but what happens, as the old saying goes, what happens with, the kids, it becomes the issue of the next generation. What happens in the public square is going to become the issue of the church too. Right. We're not immune from that.
So if the mother wants to take their son to the local church, the divorced husband doesn't want the child to be exposed to that brand of faith, whatever it is, then that's the contingent,
Yes,
the conflict.
You see conflicts like this in Christian schools right now with a lot of our Christian school clients, and that's only going to grow for churches where you're going to have a custody policy. If you, as a church, don't have that yet, you're going to have one. I guarantee in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to have, as you have more and more broken families
right.
that you're trying to reach, and you're trying to and bring the gospel to. You're going to have to, with those what we talked about when we first started. You invite people. All people come with baggage. So every person you invite onto your campus, you are inviting not just them and the opportunity to disciple them and convert them,
but everybody they're related to.
Everybody they're related to.
Every situation they're involved in.
And also the 10 different people they have been in their life. They're, who they are now, who they were a year ago, all the baggage and problems, and you invite all that, and you're accepting all that. And so you've got to be prepared to, as the Bible says, in and out of season, you've got to be prepared to handle those things. And some of these issues are, and this, I mean, you're dealing with homeless come into your church. Well, guess what? You just started a homeless ministry. You're now collecting clothes. You're now collecting food. You're now having to figure out, how do we house people? You start seeing an uptick in single mothers coming through. Well, you're going to be buying a lot of diapers in your future as a church. So I think churches have got to be, they have to have good, strong governing structures. They've got to learn how to get ahead of being reactionary all the time and being proactive, so that they're in a healthy spot where they can start to forecast the changes they're seeing demographically. So they know, because if you read on the headlines what's going on in your community, sooner or later you're going to be hit with that issue. So you need to be prepared and start putting plans in place, so when the need arises, you're ready to go.
So every pastor needs a good attorney, huh?
They need a good attorney. Yeah, they need a good attorney. They need a great attorney. We used to tell everybody every church needs a good attorney, and then we had people saying, no, they need a great attorney.
Oh, yeah.
But they need a great attorney. I will tell you, they need a great realtor. They need a great banker. They need a great insurance salesman and broker. They need a great counselor. They need a great professional in every area of life. And the good news is that their pews are full of them.
Yeah, most of the time there's somebody out there who this is the thing they do.
This is what they do.
And they would be honored to serve their church by offering it.
And we've talked about this before, and I know that you've been big on this, is that, they might not be the one that is called to be in the nursery, to be the nursery worker.
But they may be
this. Yeah, they can be the CFO of the church, or the chairman of the financial board, or they could be the one looking for new property over the next 10 to 15 years as you have a need to grow, or helping with insurance policies. This is, we were trained in law school, my wife and I, where the punchline and the mission was, the law is more than a profession, it's a calling. And I would say that's true of any profession, whether you're a doctor, a realtor, you're a banker, you're a construction foreman, contractor. It's more than that. It's a calling. And if you're not using that gifting in to advance a calling,
right. It's a mismanagement of ministry.
Correct.
Really
it's a mismanagement of ministry. And as a church, a pastor should be doing that.
Yeah.
You should find out what are the occupations and the talents of everybody in the pew, and you should do everything you can to advance and set them up for success in those areas.
Yeah. And that's another podcast.
That is.
All right. So
thank you for having me.
The one thing we wanted, got homework, and here's your homework. If you're a pastor, if you're a leader of a local church, then head back to your church, get those original documents, and make sure that they're up to date and doing for the church and for you what you need them to do. I'm Mike Glenn. That is Miles Terry, and we're glad you joined us here for this podcast.